that's involved with the response. So something to keep in mind, that our brains are really influential in this whole process, obviously. I'm going to talk a lot about active listening, and that's something that we're going to discuss in the breakout room. I have to say, active listening is probably the most undervalued and also effective disaster behavioral health intervention that we have. It is so hard to really sell the concept of active listening if it's not something that you're really familiar with, because it's not very concrete. And it's hard for folks to understand like how that looks in real life, that it's able to support someone and how it actually helps them feel better neurologically. So I'll explain more about why that's the case, but active listening is 2 thumbs up, 5 stars, highly recommend. I really want to push this one forward. And it shouldn't be more work, right? It should be doing something different, but not giving you a lot more to do. I'm going to share the SAFE model, which is the de-escalation model, the acronym that I came up with, and then talk a little bit about motivational interviewing. This might be a technique that you use already professionally, but it can be used in many different contexts. It does work with partners and children, not just with professional connections with folks. And then again, family stuff. Okay. So the biggest issue that's going on in the brain right now in terms of the context of where we are in the disaster is that things are not as integrated as they should be. The limbic system, which is the emotional center of processing in the brain, is really, really exhausted. And one of the primary effects of having the limbic system be so exhausted for such a long period of time is that it is not, it's not quite up to the task of scanning for threats in the environment and then getting us to react appropriately to those threats. In answer, looking at the chat and sort of keeping up, I believe the slides are available. I don't know. Yes, I'm getting a nod on that one. Yes, I'm happy to share them. So I think that they will be put up on the website or shared with the participants. So the limbic system is basically over responding because it is so used to having been on duty for such a long period of time. Over the last year, it's basically been a year. And typically when we activate fight or flight, right, there's a bear, I'm just making this up, right, but a bear is coming and we have options. We can fight, hide, or run. Well, what's happening right now is that the limbic system has been so used to scanning for threats like political issues, social issues, murder hornets, all these strange things that have happened in the last year. We are constantly on guard. And then what happens as a result of that is that we react impulsively, or more impulsively and a little bit more emotionally than we otherwise would, because the prefrontal cortex is not really at the table. It's still there, but another function of being so exhausted and having our sleep disrupted to such an extent is that the prefrontal cortex, which is in part responsible for regulating our responses to other people and saying, maybe they didn't mean that text message in such a snarky way, or maybe that email was actually a neutral request and they're not criticizing me. Like that little check and balance that our brain has, that's not happening so much right now. So we tend to respond very quickly, like, what do they mean by that? And we tend to snap a little bit more than we otherwise would. That affects all of our perception. Physically, what's going on in the environment, especially work emails and text messages from other people. I've said this before, but it is worth a repeat. Our brains are more likely to perceive neutral information, including any kind of communication, as being negative, threatening, or hostile right now, because it is tuned up to that. And our prefrontal cortex is not filtering and, really editing our responses the way that we should. If we can take a little bit more time before we respond in general, that is going to be the simplest, most effective way to sort of regulate our emotional response in communication in general. So taking a pause, taking a breath before we respond allows the prefrontal cortex to integrate, filter, sort of influence what's going to happen, and then we respond. We're much less likely to snap that way. So contextually, that's what's going on, partly because we're so tired. In addition, the cognitive issues are a serious thing right now, and that also influences how we communicate with each other. Again, I've said this previously, but most adults in the United States right now feel like they have either symptoms of ADHD or early onset dementia to some extent. It's terrifying. You laugh, but I'm serious. We walk into another room and have no idea why we went in there. maybe this is just me, but you go to the grocery store for like 3 things on your list and you don't get any of those 3 things and you come out with ice cream and chocolate or something not healthy. We just can't keep track of details. We get distracted all the time, and the memory is shot. How does this relate to communication, you may ask? Well, if any of you are in any kind of a relationship with someone and they say, but we just talked about that. We decided on this and it was going to be this. Or at work, you told me you were going to follow up on this thing. Well, maybe you did have those conversations and you did engage in those decision making and you just don't remember. That happens so frequently to all of us right now. So the way that our cognition is affected right now directly influences our ability to communicate effectively with other folks. In addition, we have behavioral and physical. So I mentioned this trouble sleeping. Another neurological effect of being 1 year into a disaster cycle is that the exhaustion is just so real. And when our brains are tired, they aren't integrating. Things are not flowing the way that they normally would. And that affects communication as well. Not just perception, but our ability to sort of, word find. It's come up in the last 2 weeks. Three separate people have asked me, is it normal to have trouble finding words right now? Like not remembering the names of things? Yes, it is normal. And I will say, one of the speedy little tips about word finding difficulties is that what you should try to do if you can is just keep talking. It happened to me last week. My son had something. It was a box and I could not remember the word box. I was like, that thing that's a square basket with handles and you put stuff in it. And what you want to do is just make your brain keep creating words because that will jar things loose a little bit. I know how crazy that sounds, but it actually works neurologically because when you get your brain to produce language, you are stimulating the parts that are stuck a little bit, and that will just help with that whole process. So word finding difficulty is incredibly common right now. Just kind of try and talk your way through that. Okay, what else? Yeah, keep describing something exactly like Holly mentioned in the chat. Okay, so this is fundamentally where we need to start. This is about keeping in mind all of that stuff about the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system and how those pieces really have to work together in synchronously in order to communicate effectively. Where we want to be when we communicate with other folks is in this green zone. We want to be alert, we want to be focused, we want to be kind of, ready to remember what's being said and track things and respond appropriately, whatever's going on. Where we often find ourselves right now is not in green, right? We're blue, we're exhausted, we're yellow, we're kind of had too much caffeine maybe, a little worked up, or we're red. The red zone is probably the most concerning zone because that's anger. And usually when people get really angry or upset, there's been adrenaline that's been released. So adrenaline is tricky because it's helpful. We need it. It keeps us safe. But when it gets released, it takes a minimum amount of time, usually 15 to 30 minutes, usually closer to the 30-minute mark, for adrenaline that's been released to be reabsorbed into your bloodstream, right? So when you find yourself really, really upset or particularly angry about a thing, that is a function of time. And consider this with kids too, and with patients and with colleagues. When people are really upset, it is a function of time and space before they are able to go from red back into green. That's an issue of walking away, giving something space and not continuing to hound it. If you tend towards anxiety, it might be an instinct for you to keep going after the thing, keep talking about it, follow I want to solve this problem now in order to alleviate some anxiety that you feel. And I understand that, and it's totally valid, but it's not particularly helpful in that context. So if you can recognize, okay, my anxiety is causing me to want to continue to communicate with this person, but they are really upset right now. And for you to take a pause and recognize, okay, my anxiety is driving my behavior right now. Their adrenaline is responsible for their, communication style and ability right now. I have to step back from this, as uncomfortable as that may be. And a psychological trick to help you feel better about that choice is to recognize what's the worst case scenario. If you play the tape all the way to the end, taking a break actually makes a lot of sense in terms of getting the outcome that you're trying to look for. Your anxiety can be relieved a little bit by saying, okay, if I allow them the space to calm down, I can re-engage with them in just a few minutes, really, like just a brief amount of time, And the likelihood of successfully resolving the issue is going to be so exponentially higher, so much higher, by just giving them that space, even though my anxiety wants me to keep pushing through. Great question in the chat. Upset in a check, I'm not sure what that means. Supervisor knew I was upset, asked me to work through it. We did, but I think it would have been better if I stepped away. That is what I'm suggesting. That is, and Sharon asked a great question. Do we communicate differently with a spouse, kids, bosses, and coworkers? Yes, we communicate differently, but not neurologically. We use different vocabulary words. We might use a different pace. We might use a different style. Code switching is a communication style depending on what group you're with, culturally, language-wise, accent-wise. You might use different vocab, different styles of things, depending on the group with which you are speaking. But neurologically, communication requires the same level of baseline. So this neurological stuff applies across groups. And using the example from Chloe, that I am suggesting that when anyone finds themselves in the red zone, to take some space and take some time before trying to reconnect about the issue. Okay, last piece about this. If you are in blue or yellow, how do you get to green? Well, the easiest way to do that, the most simple way to do that is called bilateral stimulation. And it's, again, neurological brain stuff. So what that means, all that means is that you have to activate and stimulate both halves of your brain and get them to talk to each other. The easiest way to do that is to physically get up out of your chair, move both arms and both legs, take a little walk, do some laps around your dining room table, get both halves of your body going, and this half stimulates this hemisphere and this half stimulates the other side, and things go back and forth. And that is the simplest way to go from blue or yellow into green. Not more coffee, right? Not a nap. Those are the wrong directions maybe. But yeah, just physically moving your body and stimulating both halves of your brain is the easiest way to go. And keep that in mind for kids too. When they're on the online school, when they're in Zoom, they need to get up and they need to stretch and move themselves around very, very frequently, as do we. Okay. Active listening. I mentioned this at the beginning. This is just really the 5-star, response recommendation. This is the most powerful intervention in our toolkit right now. It's not hard. It's not complicated. And what I want to make sure everyone's comfortable with is that what I'm not suggesting here is to have a junior woodchuck therapy session with anybody. This is not 45 minutes where you sit down and just have a therapy moment, especially if you're talking about a professional context or a coworker. Active listening is perfectly acceptable and fine to engage in with anybody for 5 minutes at a time, 10 minutes at a time. It's not like someone is just divulging their whole soul to you. It's not about that. It's about how you listen and why you're listening to someone. The reason why culturally active listening is not very, I should say, promoted in the United States is because it's not oriented around problem solving. Typically, when we talk to each other, it's that you have an issue, especially professionally, like you come to your supervisor with an issue and you and they work it out. Like you go from A to Z, you problem solve, and you try to get to a conclusion. That's absolutely not what active listening is about. Active listening, rather than going from A to Z, active listening is going from A down deep into A. You're listening for the purpose of understanding truly and caring about what someone's experience has been, not trying to fix it or to solve an issue. And again, that is not our work-oriented mindset in the United States so much. That's not how we function professionally. So it's a weird transition to make, but it is incredibly helpful for 2 reasons. Number one is that active listening actually increases connection between the speaker and the listener. And connection is part of resilience. We need connection. Problem solving can actually increase disconnection. It doesn't make people feel closer to each other. Sometimes it's helpful, and sometimes you need to have a problem solving conversation. But when someone is distressed, right, active listening is actually an incredibly powerful tool to help someone work through their distress. I love this comment from Carrie. I'm going to come back to that when we talk about de-escalation, because active listening is also part of de-escalation, and that is a really good point that you're making. The physical space and posture with an open and active listening mindset. Yeah. So if you're not super familiar with this, one of it's not complicated. What you want to do is just ask open-ended questions, right? Going deeper with a thing is who, what, where, when, why, how. So how are things going in your life? And if people say fine, what do you mean by that, right? How are your kids doing? What's going on with your family? Like, how are things feeling for you personally? And again, active listening is something that you have to have the bandwidth for. It does require a different level of attention. And if you are exhausted and if you are suffering from compassion fatigue, this isn't going to work for you to try and do. And that's okay. Like, it's not the right thing all the time for everybody. It's just a helpful concept to try and do in general. The last thing I'll say about this before we do breakout rooms is that I was giving a talk, this was a couple months ago now, I think, in my COVID brain timeframe memory. And one of the participants said, when I try to actively listen, it really is frustrating because I don't feel like I'm being helpful. And that's exactly the crux of the issue. Active listening is not designed to be helpful. It's designed to be understanding and caring. You're not supposed to be helping. You're supposed to be understanding and caring. And so the purpose of the engagement with the other person is different. And if you let go of the idea of trying to be helpful, then you can open yourself to try and understand them. And it just changes the whole dynamic. So if you don't mind, could we post the questions for the first breakout room? Perfect, thank you. So we're gonna do 10 minutes of breakout rooms. And I just want you to talk in small groups about examples where this has been applied for you. So the questions, any of these will work. And I believe the chat should be visible to you while you're in the breakout room. But when is a time that you expected to feel heard by someone, either professionally or personally, but you weren't, right? But you expected to, so you went into a dynamic thinking, this person is going to understand me, but then you weren't, and how did that feel? And then conversely, when was a time that you expected to be ignored, dismissed, or not listened to, like not connected with, but you were? And it was this, I'm guessing, pleasant surprise, like, wow, I really was heard here when I wasn't expecting to be. And then the third question is, have you tried this before? And if so, how does it go? Like, maybe you're a pro at active listening already. And what are some techniques that you can share with your group? Or ideas about how to effectively practice it and get started with it if it's not something that you're very familiar with. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share there for a moment. And I think we're going to get the breakout room started. Do I have to do that? Sorry, no, you're going to do it. Okay, good. Just a few people in each one, and just feel free to answer any or all of those questions that are posted, but you don't have to. Just choose what works. So I hope that was interesting or helpful to you all. We had a good chat in our room. I think sharing some of these experiences that we're all part of right now is a really, really key piece. So thank you for your participation in that. We'll do one more breakout room towards the end. Let me do a time check for myself. Okay. So I'm going to share with you now a de-escalation model. This is based on my work I did my internship and my postdoc at a prison, actually. So it's partially from a corrections background, but it's also from disaster response. So I've done a lot of work all over the world in very scarce resource environments. And whenever you're in crisis standards of care or scarce resource environments, people get very, very upset very quickly. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of resource scrounging and a lot of hostility that happens as a result of that. So this model was developed as a result of the combination of those experiences. So it's based on 4 ingredients, right? Self, area awareness, feelings, and engagement. And yes, active listening is part of this. So the first piece about de-escalation is being aware of your own reactions. I struggle with this myself. It is very difficult to stay calm and measured when you are being aggressively yelled at or confronted by somebody else. But in fact, that's exactly what needs to happen. So this is, even on Zoom, right? Even in a virtual setting, this is something that you really have to pay attention to your message, your nonverbal messages, the tone of voice that you use. I would strongly recommend, if you can, just slowing down the rate of your speech, giving more pauses, even lowering the register of your voice a little bit. Choice of words, vocabulary becomes important. Even through a screen, if you can sit back and take a deep breath, visibly sort of try to lower your shoulders a little bit and relax. I don't know if any of you were watching me and copied that, but if you did, it's because your mirror neurons are active, and people have mirror neurons. We copy each other. We talked about that in our breakout room, but we have the ability, this wonderful gift ability to watch what other people do and copy that. So when we are being modeled calmness and sort of healthy self-care oriented behaviors, our tendency is to copy those things. Even with masks on in a face-to-face setting, you can communicate with nonverbals. If somebody is really smiling, you can always tell because their eyes change. If they're fake smiling, their eyes don't change, but if they're real smiling, their eyes change, which you can see with a mask on too. Someone mentioned in the chat earlier, keeping open hands. That's absolutely the case for a lot of different reasons. If your hands are in your pockets, it's harder to defend yourself if you have to, and that's just a reality. But if you have an open posture, you can have your hands open and down next to the sides of you. It is much more of a interactive and integrative posture than having your arms crossed in front of you or even your hands in your pockets. So being aware of your whole physical space, as well as the speed with which you are responding and your own tendency to respond quickly. Remember, the limbic system here is likely to escalate you as well, because the limbic system wants to keep you safe. So staying calm yourself is the most tricky part of this whole endeavor, but it's essential because otherwise it becomes escalation and not de-escalation. The next piece is about physical area. So for any of you who are working actually in physical proximity with other people and not just at home, one of the biggest misconceptions about de-escalation is that you want to be closest to the door. That's not true. You want the angry person to have access to the exit so that they don't go through you or over you to get out. Ideally, in an ideal world, you both have equal access to the door or to the exit. But if that can't be arranged, then you want to let them have that access. I know that's a weird thing, but it's one of the conclusions from the research. Your general physical area includes other people who can just pop in and check on things. Hey, how's it going? Like if you know you're going to meet with somebody who tends to get very upset and escalate, have a colleague stick their head around the corner and just, knock on the door. Hey, you have a message, or just, leaving you a note. You can arrange some kind of a code ahead of time if you want to. Being aware of what's physically in your space in terms of potential weapons, other resources. Where's the phone? Do you have a phone on your desk? Is it your cell phone? All of those kinds of things. Just being tuned in. Our brains are surprisingly poor at this. And so it is something that we need to draw our attention to. The third one is the most tricky from a psychological perspective. And I find this the most helpful for me personally. Anger is a very culturally acceptable emotion for people to have. It's also physiologically very easy to access. It's easy to get mad. It's a lot more difficult for people to experience and express distress in a different way, right? So, for example, anger is oftentimes, as a psychologist, I would estimate that anger is 80 to 90% of the time really about another emotion that's harder to tolerate, like fear or anger or sadness. And it's usually fear, not always, but usually. For example, when someone is angry about restrictions or somebody telling them what to do, or I can't do this thing, right? Typically, the fear underneath that is about powerlessness or fear of the unknown, not being in control of something, and just having things happen that you are not in charge of. So that sense of powerlessness is huge with anger. If you can use active listening to figure out what's going on underneath the expression of anger, that's when you're really going to make some progress and understand what someone else's experience is. Anger not just being culturally sort of acceptable, but it's also easier to tolerate because it's externally expressed, right? I am expressing my distress out of myself. Fear and sadness are things people have to tolerate internally, and that's a lot harder for everybody. That's just a human thing, right? So by figuring out what's going on underneath that's motivating the anger, and oftentimes an angry person won't recognize that. They're focused on the anger. They're not focused on what's actually causing it underneath. So empathy and active listening, empathy can be triggered by active listening. Asking questions in order to get to the deeper level of what's going on with someone really, really helps de-escalate. The last piece of this model is about engagement, and there are 2 levels of engagement. So the first one is to engage with the angry person, right? To talk to them, to listen, don't be dismissive of them, engage resources to help them. Now, I know I'm saying identify people or information or other things that can help, but it needs to be a balance between active listening, which is not problem solving, and then potentially resource acquisition, like finding other things to connect them to that are going to help support. addressing the issue, not just saying, yeah, we'll talk about it later, because that's likely to escalate someone. So that's the first part of engagement. The second part of engagement is really about you as the provider or the colleague or the parent, about the supporting person. And it's about engaging support for yourself. So when you have a conflict, I'm trying to combine words, confrontation with someone else, don't keep that interaction to yourself. I am not suggesting you post about it on social media, but what I am suggesting is that you process it somehow. Don't internalize it. So talk to a trusted colleague, share it with a friend or a family member. Like, listen, I got into it with a stranger at the grocery store today, and it was so weird. And they yelled at me about this, and it just was so uncomfortable. But that helps you work it through, and then you won't have to internalize it. And it helps you just kind of get past it rather than keeping you up at night, like replaying it in your head. So the last thing is to engage resources for yourself if you've been involved with conflict type communication with folks. Okay. I'm going to say a little bit about motivational interviewing. I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with this as a technique, but motivational interviewing, if you just kind of Google around with it, it's a well-supported concept that is used frequently to help people change their perception of and behavior around substance use. Not exclusively, but that's where it came from. That's where the research came from. And motivational interviewing is a tactic that allows people to recognize and focus on what's not going well in their lives, like what's causing distress for them, in order to create some kind of a behavior change. So you focus on the behavior that is a potential to change, like behavioral activation, like what's a small difference that can be made. And you want to amplify concerns. You want to focus on what it seems to be causing the distress, or what is the chain reaction here that's resulting in you feeling really bad about something. And pick it apart a little bit, and don't look at the whole big, don't look at the whole big picture and get focused on like, we have to fix all of this stuff right now. Motivational interviewing isn't about that. It's about understanding thoroughly what is causing distress for the person, and then trying to have them identify, ideally, a small behavioral step that they can make that's different than what their typical pattern is. So open-ended questions, just like with active listening, are a key feature of motivational interviewing as well. Another thing you want to do with motivational interviewing is talk about the obstacles. Like, what are the roadblocks to change for you? You want to feel better, you want to be happier, you want to feel more stable. What are the things that are getting in the way? And sometimes when you name the dragon, it loses its power. So just identifying what the thing is that you think is a roadblock, especially when you're talking it out with another person, that actually alone might help, give it less control over you, whatever the thing is. Whether it's thoughts, whether it's fears, whether it's assumptions. I was working with a client who had basically panic disorder, panic attacks, and she was really, really afraid to drive on the freeway because she was convinced she was going to get a flat tire, and then what, right? So part of what this process looked like for her was to play that tape all the way to the end, and that's helpful for anxiety in general. But it's like, okay, imagine you get a flat tire on the freeway. What happens? Play the tape out. Well, then I would pull off to the side. Sure. And then what? Well, then I would call AAA or my dad. Okay. And then what? And then they would come and fix the tire, or I would learn how to do it. Yes, you could. And then what? And then I would have a spare tire and I could go to my job. And then what? And then I would get the tire, you go all the way to the end and you play that all the way out and you get to the final thing. It's like, well, then I have a spare tire or a new tire, but I got where I needed to go and everything ended up okay, even though it was, annoying couple of hours. And that, if you get there, if you mentally work your way all the way through that, that can make the behavior and the anxiety at the beginning different. It's like, well, now I'm going to drive on the freeway because I'm not as afraid of the what if, because I worked it through. So that's another option. Help them imagine what the mountaintop looks like. What is the life with less distress? What is the life with less anxiety? What parts would be better? How would other people respond to that? How would your relationships be different? How would maybe you would be more effective at certain things? How is it going to impact what you do? And again, motivational interviewing works with teenagers. It works with adults. You can do it across developmental levels for sure. So if you're curious to learn more in detail about this, there are a lot of resources that are available online. I don't have the opportunity to cover them in depth here, but I do suggest just looking around at what some of the standard practices are around motivational interviewing online. The last step is just to encourage small practice. Once the person picks a small behavior that they want to change, that behavioral activation piece, see how it goes. Try it. See what you can do differently. And then at the end of the day, like do a little inventory. How did it go? Was it different? Maybe it wasn't. I worked with a depressed teenager a long time ago, and this kid was stuck in depression. And all that changed, it ended up being that he picked a different hallway to walk down at high school between classes. Now, this was in person, right? This was a few years ago. The only thing that changed was that his behavioral activation was that he was going to go a different route to his second period or third period class or whatever it was. And that was the thing. That was the tiny little practice that changed the chain reaction, because he saw different faces, there was different light, it was a different environmental experience, and that started this chain reaction. So it can be a very, very small thing like that. Okay. The last section before we kind of get into our last breakout room is about family communication. So remember those zones of regulation, and that we want to be in the green zone, and slowing down, taking a pause before we respond is definitely going to make things more effective. For younger kids, I have a 2-year-old and a 5, or he just turned 3 last week, 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, modeling emotion regulation. Like when you get upset, just call yourself out like, oh, you know, ooh, mommy's upset right now. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to think about this, and then we'll talk about it in a second. Like talk that out in front of kids. That's super healthy for them to see. Give them accurate, truthful information about what's going on. This is particularly important around death and grief and loss. Oftentimes adults think that we are protecting kids by not giving them all the information, and that is not true. That's one of those myths. The issue is that children's brains are so imaginative that if they don't have accurate, developmentally appropriate information about what happened, they will make something up in order to fill in the gaps for themselves. So if you say grandma went away on a trip, one of the things kids tend to do is think, why did she do that if she's never going to come back? Doesn't she? Did I do something? Why did she go away? So explaining death and loss and grief is really important to involve children in from a very early age. My children just lost one of their grandparents a few weeks ago, and talking about it out loud in front of the whole, as part of the family, it really does help them process through the experience of it and increases this communication. Just make sure that it's developmentally appropriate, like the language that you're using, right? For teenagers and adolescents, boy, I love working with teenagers clinically, I really do. Behavioral management should be as straightforward as it can be, and with as much emotion.
Crisis line, can I help you?
Oh, I don't know what's going on with the crisis line, sorry. What you want to do goal-wise is to try and get things on paper. So I do behavioral management training with a lot of the families that I work with, and getting it down on paper. What are the expectations and what are the consequences and the rewards? Write it down. Set those expectations, make them clear, and don't move the goalposts. I don't think there's much that drives a teenager more crazy than not knowing what it is they have to do to earn back the thing, or to get on your good side, or whatever it is. Get it on paper, put it on the fridge. If you do X, this is the consequence and this is the reward. If you do Y, this is the consequence and this is the reward. And especially for older teenagers, get them to tell you what it is. Like bring them into this. Don't do it, don't do it and then present the piece of paper. Like make it collaborative. If you do that, you can really get their buy-in. There's 2 things that happen. Number 1, it just increases communication in general. But number 2, it's much more likely to work, because a teenager will actually tell you, if you take my phone away, that is like a world ender for me. So you know that you have a consequence or a reward that's powerful and that works for them. So again, being collaborative with them and setting these clear expectations around behavior helps take pressure off of everybody. It allows you to have the relationship separate from the behavioral expectations as much as possible. And as a parent, I know how hard that is, but goals, right? Work together on the collaboration. Okay. And yes, because it's their idea. That's an excellent point. Other things. For kids 5 through 12, any window of communication is a good window. They are going to want to talk to you at the most random times of day, and it is not convenient for you, and that's just the way it works. So make sure that those windows and that space is available and open to them. They don't pay attention to our schedules. What's new? Shift your expectations. Recognize that kids are going to have regression right now, and they probably already are to an extent. Emotionally, physically, developmental milestones, it is normal and a disaster for kids to slide back a little bit before they recover. So recognizing that your expectations about behavior and emotional management, we suffer and we struggle with it all the time, and we're adults. So kids, of course, do the same thing. For teenagers and adolescents, really be careful about your reactions. Try to model socially learning, like what are they seeing you do? Slow down, ask them about their goals. If they're struggling with depression, what do they want or hope for way out in the future, right? 10 years, 15 years. Positive reinforcement, labeled praise. I really appreciate the way I like that you used, you kept your hands to yourself, or that you used, good manners when asking for something. Labeled praise is incredibly effective. And positive reinforcement, we know, is the easiest way to change human behavior. And then again, clear expectations is very, very, very key. For young adults, I'm a college professor, so this is where that's coming from, but meet them where they are. 18-year-olds are going on 30 or going on 12 in a lot of cases. They are very different developmentally from each other. So meet them with what their priorities are, what's important to them and focused on. Don't assume that you know what their worries are, because they're probably not going to be the same. Yeah. Help with creative connection to peers and finding really creative ways right now to connect with other folks. I was just reminded that we are running short on time. I don't know that we are going to have time. Yeah, we have 2 more resource slides. Could we just do 1 5-minute breakout room? Would that be okay? Let's see if I can pause the share. There we go. Oops, stop. What I'd like you to do with the idea, could you post the set of questions in the chat for everybody? Perfect. So this is the last breakout room. We'll just do 5 minutes if that's okay, because we need to wrap up today. But I want to focus on this family communication idea. So examples of when you've had intergenerational communication that's gone well, the circumstances of the successful examples and how we can recreate them, or a takeaway that you think will work for you. Is there something that's relevant for your work or for your personal life that you think would be helpful here? And again, 5 minutes, and then we'll wrap up for the day. I think that's it. I will just mention these last few resource slides as we, as we finish up this one, and all of the resources that including the SAFE model and all the rest of it, is listed on our main website, which is here, the Behavioral Health Resources page for the state. If you have any questions about that, did you see that, or did I stop sharing all of a sudden? Sorry. Oh, okay. Well, you will have access to the slides if you haven't seen them already. I know that they have been posted and will be available to you. So please do participate in the evaluation process. I know that's helpful for UW MHTTC and for me as well as a provider. Thank you very much for having me today. And I hope that some of this information about communication was helpful for you as well.